From the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about him in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. And when he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to one another, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he'd been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. In Door County, Wisconsin, many years ago, I went out early one morning to watch the sunrise over Lake Michigan. It was stunning. And after having soaked that in for a while, I went to a little coffee shop for breakfast. I sat near the large window so I could keep my eye on the lake. When the waitress came to take my order, I said to her, "How great it must be to work here and to see the lake every morning." And she said, flatly, matter-of-factly, dismissively, "I don't even pay attention to it. For me, it's always been there. No big deal." And whenever I think of her, and I think of her often, I ask myself questions like, how many wonders do I fail to take in? How much beauty do I overlook? How much joy do I refuse? How much possibility do I leave unexplored? How often do I miss the presence of Jesus because I'm not expecting him? It was Easter, but for Cleopas and his unnamed traveling companion, Easter had not yet happened. For them, it was a day of tears and grief still. 2 days before, outside the walls of Jerusalem on Golgotha, literally the place of the skull, their friend and teacher Jesus had been nailed down and strung up by Roman soldiers in a brutal death, tortured, crucified as a blasphemer and a disturber of the peace. Some of their friends among the followers of Jesus whispered rumors of resurrection. But these two saw no good reason to trust the rumors. No reason for such a wild hope, wishful thinking, fairy tale, a fantasy. They were leaving Jerusalem and leaving the Jesus movement behind. Maybe they were wondering if they had wasted their time as two of his followers. They were wondering whether it had all been pointless. They were asking, have we been swept up in an illusion? Jesus was compelling and convincing. Everything he said and did was realer and truer than anything they'd ever witnessed before. He had made the lame to walk, the blind to see, the deaf to hear, the bent over to stand up straight. He'd healed the sores of lepers, embraced the excluded, fed the hungry, guided the confused, set sinners free from guilt. He'd shown them God's order of grace and truth. He'd stirred in them yearnings for justice and mercy. He'd ignited their confidence that all the wounds would be healed, all the brokenness would be restored. But now, it had come to a thudding end. His death left them blind and bereft. Their dreams had become nightmares. They had lost him. And when they lost him, they lost everything that had made their lives worth living. They were leaving Jerusalem. They were leaving the Jesus movement behind. I wonder if anyone here can identify with them. After all, they aren't the only followers of Jesus who remember a time when they were closer to Jesus than they are now. They wonder about this distance that they feel. Sometimes they wonder whether Jesus is with them at all. They recall having had vibrant faith one time, being passionately committed, but not anymore. Not anymore. So much has happened after all. So much has gone wrong. Maybe they feel ground down, worn out, used up, weighed down with regret, held back by hurt. I wonder if anyone here can identify with them. We all have those moments, I think, when we wonder if we'll ever be able to believe again that Easter is something more than an unlikely story, that it is a present experience, that resurrection is real, that Jesus is alive and loose in the world, and that he is here and now with us evermore. Will that ever happen again? It's so hard to trust, isn't it? to trust that new beginnings are actually possible. So I know a lot of people, maybe some are here today, who are on their way away from Jerusalem, from Jesus, from joy, from his friends who were their friends. We're on our way, some of us, to Emmaus. For these two disciples about whom Luke tells us, Emmaus was likely their home. It was where they were from, and it was 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they wanted to get back there. They wanted to get back to an ordinary life, to sleep in their own beds, to rest and recover, to leave behind the trouble and the trauma they'd endured, to hide from the Roman authorities who might do to them what they'd done to Jesus, and to avoid the discomfort of being with disciples who still had it, who still believed what they couldn't manage to believe. 7 miles from Jerusalem, the literal Emmaus was, but I know people who are likely in Emmaus this morning. Emmaus is where we go when despair drives us away from hope, when fear takes away our love, when disappointment shatters our faith. Emmaus is where you go when a dream dies or a loved one dies. It's where you go when failure has overtaken you, when you've had too much for too long, and it finally takes you down. It's where you go. Emmaus is where you go when you either want to escape your grief or try to outrun it. It's where you go to lick your wounds or pretend. It's where you go to heal or simply to get busy rushing past your brokenness. Emmaus is where you find something to numb your heartache. Emmaus can be found in cyberspace, in a bottle at the end of a needle, in a thicket of triviality, in the arms of a new lover, in the constantly opened refrigerator, or in the whirlwind of workaholic frenzy. Emmaus is where you go for an anesthetic for the pain of what you've lost. As Frederick Buechner said, Emmaus is whatever we do or wherever we go to make ourselves forget that the world holds nothing sacred, that even the wisest and bravest and loveliest among us decay and die. Emmaus is where we go, and it's where these two travelers went to try to forget about Jesus and the great failure of his life. These two disciples trudged away from Jerusalem toward Emmaus, and they talked with each other about everything that had happened. And it was so much that had happened. Then Jesus, whom they didn't know to be Jesus, joined them on their journey and struck up a conversation with them. What are you talking about while you're on the road? And basically they said, well, we're talking about Jesus. And how bemused he must have been that they'd been talking about him but didn't recognize him. They told him the outline of the story. And then they said, "We had hoped." We had hoped. But hope wasn't possible anymore for them. At least they thought it wasn't possible anymore for them. It was out of reach. How do you hope after Calvary? How do you hope when none of it has gone the way you thought it was going to go? In reply, Jesus, who they still didn't know to be Jesus, took them through the Hebrew Scriptures and tried to point out to them that God had for hundreds of years been doing the unlikeliest things. God had spoken creation into existence out of chaos. God had delivered slaves from an empire in Egypt into a promised land. And while they journeyed to that land of promise, God had rained manna down from the skies to feed their hungers. God had caused streams to rise up in the dry desert. God had brought exiles home. God had been doing the kinds of reversals that resurrection is the ultimate expression of. These miracles of reversal all pointed to this grand and great reversal of his resurrection. And something twinged in them, but they didn't know what to make of it. Now, I'm not sure why the disciples didn't recognize Jesus. Was it because a resurrection body, what Paul calls a spiritual body, whatever that is, was it because a resurrection body, a spiritual body, is different enough from the physical body that it was confusing for them to look at? Maybe. Was it because the wounds had scarred him beyond recognition and he looked like any other victim of Roman crucifixion? Maybe. Was it because there was such glory and radiance and beauty about him that they just couldn't take it in? Maybe. But perhaps it was because they weren't expecting him. It's troubling how easy it is for us to overlook the presence of Jesus in ourselves, in one another, and in the world. If we're not looking for him in the first place, it's really astonishingly easy not to see him at all. But there he was, a stranger with them on the road. Do you remember? I'm sure you do. Do you remember Jesus telling his followers before he died that they were going to find him in the stranger? I was a stranger, and you welcomed me, Jesus said in Matthew 25. I was hungry, and you fed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in jail, and you came by to care about me. And the people in the story that Jesus was telling about dealing with the least and the last and the lost, the people said, but when was it? When was it that we welcomed you, fed you, clothed you, visited you, took care of you? In other words, they did it but they didn't know it was him. And Jesus said, inasmuch as you've done it to the least of these who are my kindred, you've done it to me. Jesus is in the stranger, especially the needy, marginalized, overlooked, on the streets stranger. And I'm sure you recall that the writer of the Hebrews talked about how the ancient patriarchs and matriarchs had sometimes offered hospitalities to strangers and discovered in the course of offering their hospitality to strangers that they were, this is the phrase, entertaining angels, unaware. The writer could just as well have said, maybe when we show hospitality to the other, we're entertaining Jesus himself. There was an old monastery that had once been vibrant and filled with postulants and monks, and it had fallen on hard times, and all that were left were a few old monks shuffling back and forth to the cloister, saying their daily prayers and wringing their hands about what the future held for their monastery. And so the abbot of the monastery went to see his good friend, the rabbi. I love it that he went to see the rabbi. He went to see the rabbi and he described his problem. And the rabbi said, I'm going to give you advice, but you can only say it to your brothers once. Tell them, the Messiah is among you. And so the abbot gathered the old shuffling monks together and said, the Messiah is among us. And the monks began to ask each other, well, who is it? Who is the Messiah in and with? Is it you? Is it you? Is it you? It couldn't possibly be me, could it? But they began to wonder, where's the Messiah? The Messiah is here. Where is he? And so they treated each other with gentleness and kindness. They took a second and third look at each other, looking for the signs of the Messiah's presence. And suddenly, the quality of their life together became characterized not by despair about the future, but hope in the now that would carry them through the future. Because they were looking for the Messiah in each other, they treated each other in a way that caused other people to wonder, how is it possible for people to love each other the way these monks love each other? And so guests started to come to learn how to love again, all because they were looking for the Messiah in each other. My goodness, church, what if we looked for Jesus in each other? What if we asked the Spirit to do for us what the Spirit did, what Jesus did for these two weary travelers in their home in Emmaus, to open our eyes, to see that He is with us? My boyhood pastor lived 3 doors down the street from the house where we lived. One Sunday afternoon when I was 8 years old, I went down to his house. It wasn't unusual for me to go down to his house. My playmate Tony lived there. We were in and out of each other's houses all the time. But this time I was there to see Reverend Haig. Something was stirring in me, that it was time for me to make what we called then a profession of faith. So we went in the living room. I was hardly ever in the living room. 8-year-old boys with dirty tennis shoes don't go in the living room. Went in the living room, sat on the sofa, and against the wall there was a painting by Robert Zund called The Way to Emmaus. I didn't know that it was Robert Zund's painting of The Way to Emmaus. But I knew because Ken told me that that's the story of Jesus with the travelers to Emmaus. And it's a lovely picture. Two disciples going down a dirt path shaded by mighty oaks, and Jesus is with them in conversation. Facing that picture of these travelers to Emmaus talking with Jesus, facing that picture, I did what I could manage to do at age 8, which was confess my 8-year-old sins and ask Jesus into my heart. That was the language we used. I had no idea when I did that as an 8-year-old boy, how often in my journey I would find myself on the road to Emmaus. How often I would find that despair was easier than hope. How often it was true that fear seems stronger than love. How often something in my spirit would say, I had hoped. But neither did I know how relentlessly surprising Jesus can be. Even when we're walking away, he comes to us. He comes to us and talks with us and breaks bread with us until we can trust again that it is all true. And then we go back. We go back to the community of his friends. And our song changes, our statement changes. It's not the dirge anymore of we had hoped. Now it is, the Lord is risen. The Lord is risen indeed. Amen.